the language of democracy itself has been used against democracy. And we have to find new ways of talking about this, new ways of thinking about it.
What keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night? I worry about the state of democracy. You know, my job is about understanding the links between power, money and politics, primarily in the UK. And I can see more and more how big money and big tech is able to effectively buy and influence our politics in more extreme ways. And I think that does really worry me, because it's clearly feeding and exacerbating this kind of growing authoritarian tendencies within our politics, and I can see it, and that keeps me awake at night. I worry about where that goes.
What narrative about power do you think needs to be reframed or challenged?
I think the narrative that it's okay for money to buy power is something we should all be challenging and pushing back hard against. I think we are currently in this kind of, it feels like a cycle where it's just almost overwhelming. We can see, you know, in the United Kingdom, United States, around the world, where people who are, you know, billionaires becoming autocratic politicians, people with huge wealth, not just buying access to politics, buying up media, closing down independent media. We can see this pattern over and over. And I think we've almost become normalized to that. We've become normalized to extreme inequality. We've become normalized to the idea that those who've got money can get whatever they want in this world. And I think really destabilizing that, because I think at root that's one of the things that's driving so much discontent, political discontent, particularly in the West, is that. And I think if we could really start to show that that's really, that shouldn't be the case, that's not right, that I think would be really effective. I think too often we take it as read that it's okay for people who have money to be able to buy access, to buy power, and frankly at times even buy entire political systems.
You've spent years tracking how dark money shapes global politics. What's changed most about how corruption works today compared to when you first started your career?
You know, money has always influenced politics. This has happened from time immemorial. The famous quote, you know, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. The more authoritarian a regime, the more money distorts politics, the more you end up with this, you know, kind of parasitic relationships between an oligarchic class and a political class. When I first started doing this reporting, you know, that was already happening, that was already real, but the extent to which that's become supercharged, and I would say almost normalized, is really quite incredible. We've seen, you know, the extent to which actually, you know, we saw it just here in the UK, where we had a system where people were very blasé about this. You know, that corruption is something that happens overseas, doesn't happen here. But the reality is that you can buy a seat in the House of Lords in a legislature in the United Kingdom for life. That's effectively, I did investigations that have shown this. They are seats for sale to political donors. Political donors during the COVID pandemic were put in what was called a VIP lane for COVID contracts. Were 10 times more likely to be given these huge lucrative COVID contracts if they were political donors. This is corruption. There's been a tendency not to call this corruption. This is what it is. Now, in the era of Donald Trump, I think we're in a kind of almost a transformed world of corruption, where what was previously was kind of a nod and a wink is now actually overt. There's a relationship between business and politics has now become actually completely normalized, seen as how politics happens. So I think that's the thing that I've seen has become even more evident than when I first started this. The kind of way in which politics and politicians were influenced and bought, that kind of behind the scenes, behind closed door deals are actually now increasingly out in the open.
So I think in recent years we've also seen a lot of authoritarian practices emerge in democratic countries. What legal or institutional mechanisms could enable those authoritarian practices to emerge, as opposed to, let's say, coups?
Well, I think this is what we're seeing more and more, is that actually you can take over a political system without having to have a coup. You know, we've seen it in many countries, and I think the kind of the playbook of someone like Viktor Orban and others is really powerful to show how you do this. And it's really striking. The first thing you do is often get into power by legitimate means. You then start to use the mechanisms of the state almost against its populace. You start to, the independence of the judiciary starts to go. You start to redraw electoral boundaries. Crucially, one of the first things you start to do is attack the free press. You do everything you can to, we've seen this in America under Donald Trump at the moment. You encourage your political allies to buy media. You encourage people who support you to denigrate other media outlets. You make it harder for independent voices in journalism, in the academy, in universities to do their jobs. There's a whole playbook there. There's a playbook now that you can roll out, and this is something we're seeing more and more, this authoritarian playbook. And people are learning from each other, and more you don't have to have a coup. You don't have to have 99% of the vote in a kind of sham election. You can have this kind of, Vladimir Putin is called managed democracy. We're seeing more and more instances of managed democracy happening around the world. And I think we've been very slow at understanding how that works. We're especially very slow at understanding how technology has been mobilized and manifest to help that. It's not a coincidence that in the internet age, in the digital age, we are seeing the rise of managed democracies. I think too often we don't see how this is connected in with the changes in the modes of communication, the change in which people get information, and the change in the veracity of the information that people get. These things are all connected, and I think that's something that's too often missed in our analysis of what's happening.
Who would you say profits from the chaos?
I think we're in a moment, an inflection point in which the kind of liberal democracies that we saw from post-World War II, the liberal institutions and systems and norms of governance from post-World War II are breaking down. They're breaking down for lots of reasons. They're breaking down in lots of different ways, and they're breaking down in different places in different ways. But they are sharing some real commonalities. And I think one of the things you are seeing is this extent to which a very small number of people who are kind of genuine citizens of nowhere, a kind of oligarchic class, an oligarchic ruling class, an oligarchic moneyed class, connected to various, whether it's in former Soviet bloc countries who've got connections, who've got massive ownerships and made a lot of money from previously state assets, or it's Silicon Valley, or it's other people making large amounts of money in other ways. They are the people who now are increasingly, a small number of people who are dictating and able to influence our political system. And they are able to profit in lots of ways. They're able to profit financially, like they're able to profit because that access to state power means you can essentially print money. That is where the real profits come from. The profits come from the state. If you're able to influence the state, if you're able to have privileged access to the state, you can make a lot more money. But more fundamentally, I think that's part of it, but we're missing even the bigger thing that's happening, which is actually, I think, trying to change the very rules and the very idea of what it means, what democracy means. And I think that's something we've been very slow, again, I think, to recognize this. The language of democracy itself has been used against democracy. And we have to find new ways of talking about this, new ways of thinking about this. We have to do this really quickly, I think. I think we've kind of gotten to a place where, populists are able to use the language of democracy very effectively. Now, Donald Trump, most people who vote for Donald Trump don't think they're voting for someone who's against democracy. Joe Biden tried to win on a democracy ticket and failed miserably. In some ways, even that language isn't suitable, doesn't really work anymore. It's really about power, and what these people are doing, it's a power grab. They're effectively saying, look, these old institutions, the post-World War II institutions, the post-World War II kind of quote-unquote rules-based order, we're overturning that now. We don't care about that anymore. We don't want that anymore. And they've been able to feed on the anger of populations against, more generally, into that. And that does have incredible ability to profit from that. Not just in the short term in terms of money, but actually in setting the terms of the next epoch of what the world looks like. If you can control that, you can control everything.
Have you had any very powerful story or narrative that you've encountered recently that has helped you understand something very complex?
I think I've done a series of investigations recently looking around kind of how tech billionaires influence the world. I did a big story about the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, which is a think tank set up by Tony Blair. And myself at Democracy for Sale and my colleagues at Democracy for Sale and also at Lighthouse Reports, we were looking at a guy called Larry Ellison, who's one of the world's richest men, and Larry Ellison has given more than £250 million to the Tony Blair Institute. And we interviewed dozens of people who current former Tony Blair Institute staff, and we were interested in how Larry Ellison's money had changed the Tony Blair Institute. And what we found was that since this money came into this organisation, effectively, the goal of this organisation became more and more focused on AI and tech, it became more tech boosterish, and in some places effectively operating as a sales arm for Larry Ellison. And what I found so interesting about that story kind of helped crystallise for me how power is changing. You take somebody like Tony Blair, who's really famous around the world, almost he's probably the most famous British politician of the last 50 years. Someone whom doors open everywhere. But actually, compared to this guy Larry Ellison, who most people don't know until recently, most people wouldn't have heard of, wouldn't be able to recognise, Larry Ellison's able to effectively buy somebody like Tony Blair. Tony Blair would reject that and say, I believe in these things, but effectively that's what's happening, in some level. And that I felt really helped me understand how power is changing. And how power is moving from elected representatives and elected politicians to these handful of super rich people. And that process has been going on for quite a long time. It didn't just happen last year, it didn't just happen 10 years ago. In many respects it didn't even happen, it happened before the internet was even created. But I think stories like that are helping me to understand, even as I go along, how the people we think of as powerful often do not have that much power. And often as people sometimes we don't even know and kind of pick up out from a lineup who have got real power.
So if you had this magic ability to redirect global attention towards one underreported story right now, what story would that be?
We've tended to, as reporters, as journalists, to report about things in silos. So we've talked about the environment, we've talked about tech, we've talked about finance. We have tended not to show how these things are all interconnected, to show how, that the systems behind these are actually incredibly interconnected. We've often tended, I think, to get quite technical, get quite into the weeds of things, to almost kind of evade the big questions in the room, the big questions about money and power. And I think that's the thing, I think more and more, they're the issues we have to face head on. If we're talking about AI, for example, instead of having almost kind of hard to follow granular conversations about the latest model of AI, will it work, will it not work? Actually fundamentally going, who's behind this? Who is benefiting from this? Who's making money out of this sort of boosterism? What's the influence? How are they able to influence government so much? That's what I think we should be talking about more and more.
And what gives you hope?
I think what gives me hope genuinely is seeing people coming together and actually caring about these issues. It's very easy to think that nobody cares about the extent to which money buys our politics, but actually opinion polls show that people care about it, ordinary people care about it. Corruption is an issue people care about. And if we can actually address it, if we can start to show and prove how this can be addressed and tackled, I think people care, and I think that does give me hope. These are not issues that are completely intractable. These are not issues that people don't care about. People care about them. The problem, I think, is convincing opinion formers to do something about them.